So, what's going on, Reef Builders? I'm Jake Adams. Welcome to a new special format here on the Reef Builders channel. I got my really good, old, experienced friend, Mark Vanderwall, joining me for this pilot episode. Hopefully, we may get past the pilot stage. But why don't you tell people a little bit about your history in the reef aquarium hobby?
Sure. So I've been doing it for a while. I got my first, I like everybody. I started in freshwater, but, the marine side of things started in the 90s. First reef tank was in 95, which was pretty bad. It was, fluorescent bulbs, normal output, a skilter on the back, and wild, like real Florida live rock, not the farm stuff.
Right.
And then, I went and got a degree in biology, but didn't really end up doing much with that. But stayed in the reef hobby for, forever since then. And I met you when, in 98?
98, 99. I was working low-level coral and algae scrubbing job at a local store here in Denver. And that was like right when frag started being a commercial thing, because before then it was just whatever you were shipped. No one was breaking corals down, and we started something up by.
You actually showed me how to frag. You sent me home with a Solomon Islands back when we were getting the Solomon Island frags.
Yep.
And you sent me home with a stick of super glue and a particular coral, and you were like, here, go glue this on a rock, piece of live rock at home. And I thought you were crazy, because at the time I didn't even know that you could put acrylic super glue in a reef aquarium. And then
to be honest, you were also kind of my guinea pig, because the practice was so new that I wanted to test it out on other people. Pretty sure that was part of my MO.
I think the trippy part was I graduated from university in Colorado, and I moved to Atlanta for a job. And then I went to the local fish store here, and I walked in, and you were sitting behind the counter, and I think we both were like in a shock, like, what are you doing here?
It was a really serendipitous moment, because I thought I had lost a good reef buddy because he moved away, and we weren't super connected then. But then in Atlanta, you really were able to first flex your reef aquarium muscle, right? So this is like year 2000, 2001. I really want to introduce Mark properly to our audience, because he is one of those guys that was really influential in my reef aquarium career. Back when, especially, it was just it was something that clicked for me in my mind that would be relatable today, is that you were the one to tell me about the difference between probe start and pulse start ballast on different type of metal halide lamps, and they got my gears turning, that you just can't take anything at face value. And I really practiced that with the water flow, with the chemistry of the tanks, the culture of the coral. So you're definitely a perfect counterpart to have these kinds of really meaningful and sincere reef aquarium discussions.
Appreciate that.
So that is Mark's actual intro. Just a little bit more background on Mark. Let's see, you had some articles in Reef Frontier.
Yeah, I had a tank of the month in Reef Frontiers. I did back when Reef Central was a big deal, like the number one reef forum. I moderated a bit there.
To rewind it just a little bit, tell people what Reef Frontiers actually was, because no one knows anymore.
That was a publication that I really became the first online reef magazine, because I think they went from print to online format. That was driven by Terry Siegel.
Yep.
A notable person in reef keeping history. And at the time I had just had the audacity to send him some pictures of my college. I guess that would be called a nano reef, but back then I don't even think we called them nano reefs.
Because they were all mini reefs already, so what are you going to call something that's smaller than a mini reef? It was a small reef tank at the time, but large by today's standards.
But it got in there, and that became I don't know if it was the feature tank or tank of the month, what they called it back then. But that got me more emboldened as well to try to get more involved in the online world of reef keeping as well, which is where I, became more heavily involved at the time with Reef Central. And then, eventually life gets busy. You have kids, and I still keep a reef tank, but I just had less time to devote to that kind of stuff. So
it's a monumental task to stick with a hobby for your whole entire life. And you've had a couple dozen tanks over your career. How many tanks would you say you'd have total?
Yeah, probably at least a dozen. I have a clownfish that's older than my older kid. So, oldest kid.
Yeah, life came in, but you've stuck with the hobby the whole time. You've always had one or multiple tanks. Yeah. And even if you wax and wane in your interest, like, it was something you still did naturally because, it's just in our blood by now.
Yeah, and I think also things have shifted online a bit. So, some of the conversations that happen now are focused in areas that maybe I feel less participant in, we've talked about that before, that, there's been certain shifts in the hobby if you compare it today to, 20 years ago. We were just talking about this, like the Macna 2000 flyer, right? Things have changed a lot since then. A lot for the better, maybe some of it for, I guess, for us older reef keepers or ones that have been around the hobby a while.
It's so strange because definitely once upon a time, the community, if you could barely even call it that on a national level, let alone a local level, it's just so small that if someone else had a reef tank, you were just kind of automatically friends. So you could share notes, share corals, actually trade corals. Like, corals hadn't been valued yet in that way. But yeah, I don't want to step on the throat of progress or anything.
No.
There's a lot of things, but there's also a lot of cycles, right? Like they wax and wane. And one cautionary tale, I think, especially about more veteran reef keepers and aquarium keepers, freshwater, pretty much any hobby, is you don't want to stifle innovation. You want to let people be creative. Definitely one new trend that I find can get behind is some of these floating aquascapes, right? Like that's a cool trend after all these silly little trends. But I guess the cautionary tale I wanted to get back to, I got a little off track, was definitely our sticker shock, right? Our collective sticker shock when corals first started hitting some of these, then what we thought were astronomical values. But on a long enough timeline, it makes it so like a $400 half-inch frag of sunset monopora that used to be just impossible to obtain now is in the bargain bin of the frag section in local fish stores, right? You must have seen that, right?
I remember being on a wait list for orange Montipora capricornus.
Mm-hmm.
There was one guy in Colorado at the time, Steve Chang, who had a nice colony, and he literally had people waiting for him to frag it. That coral's pretty easy to get these days, of course. But seeing one in orange, I remember, in his tank blew me away. That was just such a random color to encounter. But yeah, now we take that for granted. Yeah.
I had a picture of a perfect orange Montipora cap, like printed out on one of these, crummy little inkjet printers from the late 90s, like literally taped up onto the wall. And it was just like this holy grail coral. And when you see a frag of it like this big or even, about this large, it's just, you see the color, you see the initial growth form, but not until you grow it much larger can you really appreciate what that coral represents. I have been let's say I've had orange cap and langside cap almost in stasis, just kind of bouncing around a couple tanks, but not given the opportunity to like regrow, because I've grown those corals so many times. But now I found definitely a tank with a particular type of lighting that's going to be so suitable for growing those nice and large.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you feel like there was a time where people got excited not just about color but also growth types, right? I mean, I remember being on the Steve Tyree wait list for Acropora solitariensis because it wasn't a particularly colorful coral, but it was a plating, scrolling-ish Acropora, right? And that, of course, I think after that we had the FLO and all of that, but I just remember there being a lot of passion around that as well, where it was just the uniqueness of maybe a species that you're accustomed to growing in a certain way being exciting from a species perspective. I don't know if that's still the case. I mean, do people really care if Euphilia is a branching or not, or those kind of things?
I feel like there's been so many new tanks set up recently and like super crowded. Right around now in the next couple years, especially after the pandemic, we might see a bump of like actually really well considered coral aquascapes, right? So definitely one of the trends that I don't really partake in is aquascaping with the rock, because that's not taking into consideration what corals you want to put on there and how they're going to grow out. But I did want to talk about your new tank. So you've been cruise controlling for a while on a few different aquariums, but now you have a new tank in mind. And I always get excited. I think you got like a 5-year cycle of setting up a new tank. Is that appropriate?
Yeah, I think like every reef keeper, I get bored and want to rebuild. And I think with every system, you discover stuff that you like and stuff that you say, okay, I'm not doing that again. So, you're always chasing that Goldilocks reef aquarium, right, where you learn from your mistakes. So I went the get bigger, bigger, bigger route, but I think I discovered, once a tank hits a certain threshold in size, the maintenance and everything just becomes a factor that I didn't really like. So this new tank's it's a 180 6x2x2, but it's going to be rimless with a corner overflow. I hate center overflows, right? That's one thing I learned from past reef tanks.
I really take it for granted that my 5-foot and my 6-foot peninsulas, my 6-foot reef tank, they don't have any. I take it for granted that they don't have bracing, but yeah, it's one of those changes that happened in the reef aquarium hobby that just kind of happened, but I don't think I celebrated that enough.
But what I don't like, what I don't like about a lot of the rimless tanks, and something I'm asking custom to be done, is the water line's always right up to the rim, maybe like an inch below.
I'm guilty as charged, and I love where you're going with this.
Yeah, so I'm not a fan of that for a multitude of reasons. I think from a perspective point of view, it actually looks a little better lower, but even just cleaning the glass, right? I don't know. I mean, I'm sure a lot of your viewers have rimless tanks, and if you get a little bit too crazy with that magnet, things splash over. I had a Tang that would splash over the wall. So I just made a conscious choice to ask the builder, hey, take your 180 rimless, drop that overflow box 3 inches, and give me a nice 3-inch wall.
God, that's insane. It's one of those things that I wish we'd been, discussing reef a lot more, and that's kind of like part of the impetus for doing this pilot episode, is because like you have some ideas, and it's just one of those things that as soon as you planted the seed, it was like inception. I'm like, damn, he's so freaking right. And I have this, this tank right now, and I have crazy flow, and I think because the twist on the propeller pushing the water like really more than it does on the opposite side, and it's splashing over the wall, and I'm really kind of battling cleaning that up all the time. But I think if you drop it as much as you say you did, your rim will stay super clean. I
think you're going to get salt spray you got to wipe down, but that's okay. And I'm also hopeful that maybe some of the more, not the big jumpers. I mean, I've seen a wrasse jump several feet, so I have no illusions that a 3-inch wall is going to keep a jumping fish in the tank. But maybe some fish because I don't like screen tops, and I know that's probably awful to say, because people probably feel like I'm risking my fish from going carpet surfing. But to have a rimless tank and then put a screen top on it, to me is it just kills the whole vibe of it. So
it certainly kills the aesthetic.
Yeah.
And I have tops on all of my tanks except the really shallow, really wide coral flats. And I got a bunch of fish in there, and it's very rare that they go for a walk, but it does happen.
It does, yeah.
But I love your idea of having a 3 inches of extra room. Do you have any plans to put some wave action in there?
Yeah, I mean, I've been looking at the Tunzi wave box, or, I mean, these days, a lot of the pumps can do it, already. So I've given that some thought.
The kinds of things I want to talk to you about on this program is how I believe that the wave box patent is expired or pretty close to expired. I mean, even if it's like in a couple of years. And so it's an awesome idea, but I would love to see some people be interested in expanding on the design. The Tunzi did an awesome job, and it's one of the most effective at making waves.
Okay. Yeah, I, that's one thing. That I can't take credit for that, right? Julian Sprung's tank, he has some extra wall of glass, and he was I believe the inception of that was for the Tunzi wave and to get his Gorgonians to dance in the wave. So that definitely inspired me on some level to try something like that as well. I also want to create some dimension above the water, maybe, if I can get away with it. I'm not sure yet, but I've been really digging that people are getting back into mangroves a bit more. You're starting to see them more.
Guilty, man. I've got a couple mangroves over here.
Your tank as well. So, having a little bit less water depth and also having a little bit of glass kind of present above water area to do things, maybe I can throw some mangroves in there and have some of the rock, egress the water. I really like when I see that in people's tanks.
So tell us and remind me what you're currently using generally for like flow, filtration, and lighting, and where you want to go with your next tank. And, in broad strokes. You don't have to get into the weeds.
Ever since you and I attended Interzoo, when was that? A long time ago. And we saw the gyro pumps. Mm-hmm. I've been a fan of the gyro pumps. That's what I'm running now. I may use those again in the new tank. I'm a bit on the fence about what I'm going to do with flow there. I've been running some AI hydras. I think the 52, 2 52s and a 26, and I love white light. I'm not into the Windex look, and those pictures are great for that. I feel like I can get into the 10 to 13K, 1,000 Kelvin spectrum pretty good. So I might change that out to try something new, just because it's been a long time I've been using these, and we all like to try new things.
So with your AIs, and you're a fan of bluish white lighting, right? Because that's probably like 10 to 12K that it would be considered white nowadays. Do you not run the program to be blue in the beginning of the day and the end of the day? Because I have big tails on the sides of what I consider my more nutritious programming of full spectrum lighting, but long tails of lots of periods of blue.
I do the dawn and dusk to get the glow in the dark look. It's
how
fun.
Long?
Corals.
How long is it? Yours? 10 minutes or 3 hours?
Like an hour on the front and the back. But I also even have a section in my lighting program where I cut down the blues before I cut down the whites. So at the end, like in the late afternoon, the blues drop, but the whites stay up. So I actually shift even more to the less blue spectrum. But then the whites rapidly trail off so that I can still get that blue look at the end of the night, so.
That's cool. So what about your, are you using max spec gyres, jump gyres, Red Sea gyres?
Yeah.
Max spec?
Yeah.
Do you find that they slow down a lot after just a few months? Because mine, right after I clean them, they are turbos, man, like water turbines, like really jetting. But it's not even line buildup. It was just a little bit of biofilm, and they're still pumping a good amount of water, but not like before.
That's actually one of my beefs with them is if you clean them, you have to go in and turn down the flow for a while. Because once they get a bit gunked up, that flow, you get that dialed in, but then you clean them, and then they're too powerful, especially for my tank, because I did the SBS thing for many years with the halides and all that, but I'm more leaning towards softies and LPS these days. And if those gyres are fresh out of like a citric acid bath, it's a little too much.
It's funny you should say that, because man, I really struggle with some of my LPSs to give them less flow. I'm just such a high flow guy. So my gyre pumps, I run them full blast all the time. And it's because I'm running full blast, I really notice the difference between when they're super clean and when they're not. But yeah, it's interesting that you notice it, because you're running them a little bit lower on your tank, but when you clean them, they're exceeding what you need for your tank.
Yeah, I love looking down into my tank a lot, so I have a lot of times where the flow is pretty low. I do have the surges program to go a little crazy to really kick up detritus. But again, when I get around the time I get done with work, I want to go and see it a bit more calm and get those top-down views and all that. So, but I notice when they're clean, the surge time is pretty bad, and I've got a pretty big leather coral that just isn't happy when I clean those pumps, and I have to dial it down a few degrees on the controller.
So hold that thought just for a second. I want to grab a couple of these bottles of the Bacterial Plankton.
Okay. Cool. Thirsty.
I mean, it took us a minute to warm up, but man, this is exactly the kind of actual reef discussion that I want to see out there. Just, there's way too much groupthink. I was thinking of whether I should say that or not, but there's way too much groupthink, and it's a lot of consensus by the masses instead of actual logic and evidence and experience. So, okay, I'm back. So we're talking about the gyre pumps. So tell me about, I guess, what you're using for your filtration and where you want to go with the next iteration.
Yeah, so I tend to be somewhat opinionated about that. So, and I don't want to sound like the crotchety old get off my lawn reefer, but I have tried I mean, you know me, but for those that don't, I've tried everything. I have an inland aquatics, algae scrubber in the closet.
You still have the
Inland aquatics, turbo scrubber.
I haven't heard that name in a minute.
I've done carbon dosing. I've done it all, and in the end, I just find that me personally and my habits, my laziness partly too, I do best with just no mechanical filtration, a refugium or macro algae scrubber, and I don't go too big on a skimmer, and that's it. I mean, very simple.
So you have a macro algae scrubber, not a refugium, because everybody's calling them refugium nowadays, and if you transport it 20 years ago.
Because if I say macroalgae scrubber, some people think I'm talking about one of those Chaeto reactors. And it's like, no, I just have a compartment in my sump, right, where I grow macroalgae and I throw a bunch in the trash once a week, and that's it.
Speaking of which, we'll get back to your filter. I grow a big old ketomorpha ball. Well, I was chasing my pH and dosing my system with some sodium hydroxide to raise the pH down one of the drains so it could go down to the sump first, and it's really potent, but I was literally adding 1 to 5 mLs for a 600-gallon system, right? And I didn't see any problem at 1 ml. So this basically drain cleaner that I use usually to kill Aiptasia is hyper effective, but by chasing pH, dosing the sodium hydroxide, I killed off my ketomorpha.
Oh no!
And then I lost more pH because I didn't have that big old barrel of ketomorpha to absorb the pH. So it's just one of those things, you chase the pH, and then I screwed myself in the end. But here's the twist: I eradicated the ketomorpha that I was growing. I got a new batch of ketomorpha, and it is completely different. And it opened up this entire world of different species and different strains of Chaetomorpha. I think a few people had started paying attention, and there was always that thought, but I always thought it grew and it was a certain way, but they're radically different. But one is a lot, I don't know what they represent, but one is a lot softer, longer, and noodlier, and the replacement that I got just grows like a Brillo pad. And I need the old version back because it was really good at just winding itself around. That created the barrel. These thick ones, they just get lumpy and they bounce around. Anyway, that's my macroalgae scrubber anecdote.
Yeah, but you kind of touch upon, obviously you weren't chasing numbers there with the pH. You were trying to tackle aptasia, but I feel like if I'm able to grow green algae or macroalgae, like, then my tank's probably in a good state, right? And people, I mean, obviously there's the other end of the spectrum where it's choking out your corals and all that, but if you've got like little turf algae and little areas of your tank that, your snails or your tangs can't get to, like from a ecological succession perspective, it's a good place to be. And even in my own tank, when I stopped seeing algae on the glass and when things zeroed out, even though I was not intentionally doing any carbon dosing or anything, I think the biomass of my soft corals got so big that I had no real available nutrients, right? That's when I had dinos. That's when the cyano showed up. Like I like to call that the primordial soup, right? Like that's your pioneer species that shows up when the whole place is a mess. But when things start to stabilize, like I just feel like algae is part of the system, and so growing it, in a sump, I don't know if it truly outcompetes what's in the tank. I'm sure if I pulled all my tangs and snails out, I'd have a problem. But I feel like it's almost like an indicator, right? Like if I have a healthy macroalgae growth, like if your Chaeto ball is doing great, like it's almost like an indication, right? Like a way to see if your tank's jiving. I don't know. That's just a theory I have on that. Don't you feel like a macroalgae or refugium is like a canary in the coal mine, right? Like it's almost like it. Because you think about all those experiments where they've removed grazers from a reef, where they put like a 1 meter section of reef and they block it off, and like no urchins, no surgeonfish, parrotfish can get in there. Algae just chokes everything out.
Yeah.
So it's not like algae's kept at bay on a reef by nutrient starvation, or like I'm chasing my phosphates down, right? Like it's really herbivory that keeps everything in check. And so here you have this section of your sump where you have, no herbivores. Sure, you got some amphipods and crap in there, but really you don't have any major herbivores. If there's no algae growing in there, then to me that's like the canary in the coal mine that says something's not right here. The tanks.
I totally agree with you. It's weird how like I only grow Chaetomorpha not for nutrient export, but mostly just as a in tank CO2 scrubber to bring up that pH and grow those corals faster. But I have noticed throughout the years and decades, I've noticed my Caulerpa then, Chaetomorpha now, actually either like dying off or not growing like it used to, because I hadn't noticed that the calcium reactor ran out of CO2.
Yeah, there you go.
But that leads me to another great point, though, is watching the algae growth to try to gauge the nutrient levels of your reef aquarium water. And I used to really operate based on the assumption that if I'm cleaning algae off the glass once a week and see some tufts of algae here and there, that there was enough nutrients for the corals. But it was, and I've been paying attention to nitrates more as a food for the corals, not as something bad to get rid of. And I was using, the commonly available test kits, but they pretty much just only vary from like 0-ish to 5 to 10 ppm. And it's just like the color was so bad. So anyway, the Hannah checker came out, was it last year? I think it was sometime last year. And when I tested my nitrates in the system behind me, which is about 600 gallons, it was 0.00. And I hadn't realized how nutrient starved my corals were. And long story short, I've been feeding so much more, so much more to the tanks. And I was feeding before, but I just didn't realize how little it was. And we used to be obsessed, right, with denitrification and really micropores inside the rocks or some media or carbon dosing for nutrient export. And it's just so funny now that coral populations are building up to a point that, just like you said, the biomass, it really sneaks up on you, how it just sucks up all the nitrates all of a sudden. Like it becomes the filter. And I've seen some other and heard some other aquarists like start to having that kind of discussion. So it's really cool that you made that same observation.
Yeah, I have an interesting story about that. So obviously my tank is soft coral dominant. Soft corals grow wickedly fast, right? So that biomass.
What kind of soft corals? Just tell us what kind of soft corals. Entertain me.
I mean, all of it, right? Cinnellarias, I've got leather corals, I've got, I even got the weedy ones, right? I love me some Xenia. But, you know, I'm at a stage in my life where I like that for my lifestyle. I'm a busy person. I've got a lot of stuff going on. And, you know, it's great how a soft coral tank can just become overgrown. They don't sting each other. Sure, there's some chemical warfare, but
let me correct you on that one real quick, because right here in the soft coral tank, I had some what we would probably consider capnella, or a greenish, thicker, not shedding kind of canyon tree. It stung the bejesus out of sarcophyton. I was really surprised. Like, what the hell? I was actually
green. I guess you call it canyon trees or whatever. And he's just, I mean, he's surrounded by other corals and no problems. So that's interesting.
It's harder to observe in some cases, but in this one, it was severe. They've been separated. That leather coral's in a different system now, and he's kind of been scarred for like 2 months. I really thought it would regenerate. I'm like, man, I'm going to have to cut that part off for it to regrow. But back to your point about your soft corals.
Yeah, so again, I like diversity. I definitely think a lot about succession and pioneer species and tank maturity a lot. And on a whim, I had ordered some sand from the Florida Keys to just add, again, you know, some bacterial diversity.
When was this?
This was last year, and I suddenly rapidly lost some really nice LPS corals that were dear to me. And I forget what the bacteria is that's in the Florida Keys right now, just wrecking a lot of...
oh, no.
There's an acronym.
This was like some like wild harvested sand?
Yeah.
I didn't know everybody was doing that anymore.
Yeah, so I was like, could I really have brought that into my tank? So
that's interesting.
Biomics guys were like, hey, send us a sample. Let's figure out what's going on. And sure enough, they confirmed that I had that bacteria in my tank, which was they've seen in some tanks, but not a lot. So again, anecdotal, but that to me was like a smoking gun.
Okay, so I mean, it's not that anecdotal. It is evidence-based, but it's just one case. You know, we'd have to see this more and more. Dude, that is fascinating. I don't think you told me that. This is the thing that I like kind of bitter with you about, is like all these years you kept doing some degree of high-level reefing, but...
Well, that's the fun of it, right? Is
you're like, oh,
you get upset losing the
take care of my reef tank, but I got some live sand to increase the biodiversity of my reef, then lost some corals, and then I realized there was disease happening over there that's well documented, so I sent off a water sample to the ICP of like molecular biology to find out what kind of bacteria growing there. Sure enough.
Well, but so the other interesting thing that came out of that test was he was saying, hey, I noticed you have no nitrite fixing bacteria showing up in these tests. They're not that they're not in your tank, but they're not at a level that, you know, are showing up on our test. And he even alluded like, you know, hey, we see that quite a bit in tanks where the density of coral is high, right? Because after a certain time, your corals are competing for a lot of those, I mean, I'll call them nutrients. I don't know what you want to call them, but so these bacterial populations potentially wane, right? They draw down because your corals are in a way the biofilter now, in a sense, consuming all of that. So again, kind of interesting that, I have a sand bed that's full of crud. I've got a bunch of soft corals. I don't do mechanical filtration, and yet my nitrates and everything bottomed out. Right? I got dinos. My macroalgae stopped growing. My glass never got dirty, and then I knew I had a problem. And I remember talking to you like, I guess I got to start dosing nitrates or just adding a crap ton of fish. So I did both, and then hey, lo and behold, things got back on track, and I started to see little turf algae on return pumps where the tanks couldn't get to it, right? And I was like, okay, this is a good sign.
That's a good point to make. Like sometimes these indicator algae will be in certain just inaccessible areas. One obvious place to look is the outflow of your in-tank pumps, and then the outlet from your return pumps. Like, I got all these coral flats over here, and anytime I turn off the flow, man, sure enough, a little school of tangs comes and nips right at that lip to do their work.
Well, I feel like that's the secret, right? Is this whole idea of starving or eradicating algae doesn't work. What you want to be is in the business of having the algae that is easily consumed by herbivores be your dominant species that, is happening in your tank, right? Like obviously there's certain types of turf algae that tangs are not going to eat. And if you end up with those, that sucks. I struggle with bubble algae at times, right? Because Mithrax crabs and certain, like sailfin tanks will eat it, but it's one of those like algae that's like, hey, I like your tank. I like living here. I'm going to reproduce like crazy. But I think you're always going to be battling something if you're in a place where your corals are happy, but you just want it to be something that things like to eat.
Right. It's funny you should mention that because, my Scalemia-dominated reef wall aquarium is currently still peaking on like Valonia outbreak. And you're right, I caught it a little bit too late. I should have had those emeralds in from the beginning when there was so little that I actually, one occasion, pulled out a couple tufts. I turned my back and I look in there and it's just like big old chunks of Valonia everywhere. Not everywhere, but you and I both have experience treating it. I use Brightwell Aquatics Razor, and I need to do a video really documenting the effect on this. Because did you use?
I use
Razor also. You use Razor also?
Yeah, I was using it because when I had the coral die off from that bacteria, shortly thereafter, I also had some weird mystery thing going on with my fish, which I thought was a bacterial issue, but later I'm starting to suspect it was an anemone in my tank. But anyway, so I thought, something's funky here. So I started to throw in some water changes, and I'd heard good things about that stuff. And that stuff's interesting.
You heard good things about water changes?
Well, no, Razor. Because I started treating that, and I've never seen my live rock so clean. It's like somebody went in there with like a toothbrush and just scrubbed everything.
It's like, so, it's, you and I are the only people that I've had this conversation with anyway, but it's like a reset for your rock. It's like the cleanest rock you've ever seen. It's like the algae are like completely eradicated, and I think I've had some success with, the prescribed like early dose, and the people that I've shared this with, they've had more of a long-term effect of completely eradicating the algae. It's not a miracle, but man, what was your experience? Did your corals react at all?
No, it was obviously my macroalgae in the sump took a hit. But I reading online, I was expecting that. I was not in it to do it long term, like add it to my dosing regimen. I just was trying to get things to turn a corner, and it was amazing that I did it for a few weeks of just dosing, and I suddenly noticed it's like, man, it's almost like I added a bunch of snails and urchins then, and they went around and just grazed everything up. So I definitely found that interesting. I personally, again, given the way that I approach my aquarium, I wouldn't want to dose it long term because I like a little algae in my system, like I was saying. I think I'm okay with that. It's just when it becomes something that you can't control, like yeah, Valonia is a pain in the butt, if it really explodes. I would have no reservations using it then.
I've had two experiences, two, three, four, eradicating it completely. In the nano reef tank that I set up in one day back in end of 2019, then do a water change for a year. Maybe like 3-month mark, the Valonia really popped up, and that was the first time I dosed it, and it really killed Valonia to my surprise. And then more recently, I did it again in that tank because it did eradicate the Valonia, but it knocked it back for like 8 months. So more recently, I did a short dose, and it knocked it back way more, enough to where I stopped dosing. But then even when I stopped dosing, it had like a weird continued prolonged effect because this is the small nano tank. I don't do water changes, so whatever that compound is, I think it has like a lingering effect on those kind of algae. And yeah, those rocks got mega clean. But again, in the tank behind me, when the tank was still, again, right at that 3 to 6 month mark is where Valonia wants to pop up. It's like simmering in the background. But in that one, I started seeing it crop up, and I didn't do anything. I added 2 or 3 emerald crabs, and then just really forgot about the problem for like 4 months or 6 months. Then I looked again, and I was like, oh, sure enough, I can't see any Valonia. So it really can creep up to an alarming degree, but with just some basic biological controls, it can creep back down. That's for sure.
Yeah, I definitely will keep it around. I don't have a problem. I know people don't like dosing chemicals, and there's worry around that, but the razor I definitely will keep around for when I may need it if things get a little bit out of hand, where it's potentially an algae that my herbivores don't want to touch. But I mean, I feel the same way about like the red slime removers. I've dosed that so many times in my history, and I've never had I know people have. I've never had a bad experience with it, and I don't mind using it as kind of a tool to push your what do you want to call it, your biome, your little ecosystem in a box back in one direction, right?
Yeah, no, it's so important to just like really enjoy your reef. And this, there's some people that can accept a reasonable to a high degree of hair algae in their reef displays. But there is something kind of magical about having like that bone clean rock with just very few red, purple, pink encrusting coralline algae, not going out of control, but really gives it, I don't know, it's a much better stage to enjoy colorful corals, that's for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, that's just what works for me, right? I mean, that's one thing is like, I feel like there's all these methodologies, but you almost need to take like a personality test and be like, oh, your personality would be really great for this type of method. And so for me, that's, yeah, I'm sort of in the same boat. Like, I don't mind the chemical treatments here and there, and I do get a little lazy with the algae at times, but I think that's why I tend to not do great with nanos, right? Because I get away with murder because I use tangs, I use urchins, I use all these things to kind of help me in my laziness. Whereas when you got like a 10-gallon nano, even like a pincushion urchin would get too big for like a 10-gallon eventually, right? I mean, it's you limit yourself, so now you've got to, I think, approach it differently.
Yeah, no, it's funny you should mention that because I definitely feel like the hobby is driven a little bit too much by what can be commercialized, such as cleanup crew. But in my tanks and over a long history, the most effective cleaners for me is like an army of stomatellas and a side legion of asterinas. Like, I don't mind pulling out asterinas, but I never had that urgency. I feel like asterinas really do a good job of like cleaning up in food. And then if you have like this huge shadow army of stomatella, little shelled snails, they really get in all the rock. But you can't practically culture those and sell those to people. It takes a while for them to build up. But it's not really that long, actually. But if you have to introduce them. So for me, like stomatellas and asterinas, that's my cleanup group. and then I'll throw in maybe like one tuxedo urchin per, only in for three, let's say 3-foot tanks and larger. Saying that, I know I don't have any in these back tanks, only in the larger tanks. And then in the largest coral flats, I also have big old abalone. We got three big abalones kicking around. They're super cool.
Well, you brought up gyres earlier, or no, it was late last year. I noticed my gyres were getting pretty funky looking, and they were probably due for a bath in citric acid. But I just went and ordered a bunch of snails and put them in the tank and just positioned like 4 or 5 on each gyre. And like the next day, this gyres were spotless,
Oh, all right. Well, that's
no question. It was like, okay, these things work, I mean, I have a 20-gallon, dare I call it a coral quarantine. It's just somewhere where I can put something new and watch it for a while. No fish in it because I don't want. I've actually gotten the ick from snails before, which so I'm a little paranoid about dumping inverts into a fish tank.
Yeah, that's a concern.
I have a fishless quarantine and had algae growing in different areas. I put a bunch of snails in there, and like 2 days later, that little 20-gallon long is spotless. So I'll be honest, 10 years ago, I was somewhat skeptical about cleanup crews, but I do think they work. I don't think you need 200 snails. I think those kits are a little crazy, but I've become a convert for sure.
I have snails. Mostly trochus. I think it's mostly trochus, but I don't buy snails. I only have small little trochus that hitch a ride on corals that I'm trading or getting from the fish store. And they should so happen to 1 out of 10 corals just kind of hitch a ride and make their way in and survive. Like, go for it. It's funny. I never transfer them, but they just end up in different tanks somehow. And I actually see a ton of small trochus-looking snails in certain places of this system in particular, but I haven't seen them grow to maturity. That's almost like they're only growing to some kind of a visible size, but not making it past that. So, to be honest, I haven't really observed that really hard, but there's some indications that it's happening.
Interesting.
So, I do want to talk just a little bit about this bacterial plankton food here. This is, what is this called? PNS Probio. And it's purple null-sulfur bacteria that's made here locally. It's a bacterial plankton. I did go to school for marine science, and we learned about phytoplankton, zooplankton, and bacterial plankton, right? But in the aquarium hobby, there's like this weird, very loose concept of marine snow, but it's not what happens on the reef. It's really kind of more like a deep water phenomenon. But bacterial plankton, we've never really talked about it. I really wish they'd just call this bacterial plankton. So I don't know that much about the topic yet. It's really new, these bacteria. This one is alive, and it's purple. And then somehow, I don't know, this one's pasteurized, and it's dead, so I keep this one in the refrigerator. But yeah, maybe they're both foods, and they're both foods, but this one, since it's alive, it also break down some stuff in the tank. This is used in high intensity aquaculture applications. So really excited to learn more about this stuff. It's actually made here locally, so I was able to spend some time talking to the founder, picking his brain. But it's such a new topic to me and to the aquarium hobby. Yeah. And it's going to take some time to wrap our heads around it. And I know it won't be super obligatory, or you don't have to have it to grow a nice reef tank. But I'm hoping that it will have some new applications, like feeding non-photosynthetic soft corals.
That's what I was going to ask. Is that's. I mean, I don't want to make generalizations because I do see some people out there trying to work with Dendronephthias and all those things, but. There was definitely a huge curiosity about those corals and trying to figure those out, back, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago.
It was right about 10 years that the
again.
azox.org kind of kicked up, but I don't know. I feel like that was almost like the tail end of what we would call classic reef keeping. That is, in some ways, we don't have to be grumpy, get off my lawn mood, but just it's been supplanted by a little bit more of like what I would call Instagram culture, right? None of those NPS make for fluorescent colors and make for a ton of likes. It's they're challenging, but I think it's going to be a combination of both like the food and how you feed it that's really going to make the difference. So I've experimented. I wouldn't say I've kept them. I've kept them alive for a long time, but that doesn't count because they take a long time to waste away. But I've done it 2 or 3 times, like really focused on them in a particular way. But I have a new tank, again, a pilot program to try to feed this food in such a way that it concentrates for the coral. So this is the other thing that's kind of frustrating is there's 2 Dendronephthias. One of them is super smooth, it's kind of orange at the base, going to like really pink branches. And then the other one is the classic super spiny one, kind of purple with some like yellowish spicules. They're totally different corals, right? They're both supposedly carnation Dendronephthias, but they're totally different. So the chili coral doesn't mind. He's open all the time. I got a little bit of Scleronepthia. That's kind of like a ratty rock. So I think one of the other things that's going to be super important for any chance of success at Dendronephthias and its non-photosynthetic soft corals is starting with a good specimen. Like they really do starve sometimes in between being collected and arriving to you. And I'm not sure if that's something they can come back from.
I'd be curious to test that on a softie tank too, just in general. Just because, I mean, yeah, you know, most of the softies that are kept are photosynthetic, but I guess in my personal experience, and you know me, I'm not a big coral feeder. I just have never really seen. I mean, you know, you can sprinkle that micro granular food on these corals and they close up, but are they really eating it or are they just pissed off because you put something on them, right? So taking even like a leather coral or you know, like a Kenya tree, you know, not to dive into common names, but like how would they react to like a bacterial plankton, right? Like would they benefit from it? It'd be interesting to see.
What would be a really interesting trial is a tank without feeding, you know, a tank with direct coral feeding to achieve a particular nitrogen level or a particular nutrient level, and then a tank where you literally just added the nitrate straight to the tank. You know, it's hard to know how much of my feeding is really getting into the corals versus polluting the water, raising my nutrients, and then that's feeding the algae.
That's always my question about amino acids, right? I love amino acids. They were a godsend when we first got hit by red bugs, and we didn't have the interceptor idea yet from, I think it was Dustin that came up with that. But so yeah, I'm a huge fan. But there was also that question was like, well, aren't amino acids also a source of nitrogen in a sense? Yeah, so.
I never listened to those voices, man. I didn't participate in that group think. I don't. Something you and I sort of got each other into it. I think I don't remember exactly how it started, but I remember adding it, and then getting to a point where I could tell whether I was adding it or not, and I could visit people's tanks right when it kind of bumped. You know, there's like a bump and bump to the sulfur coralline amino acids. I could look at somebody's tank and tell if they ran out.
Really?
Yeah. I think I've told you this before. I have this thing where I look at the growth tips of Acropora. And even like Suharsenoi, from Humulus to Suharsenoi to Pulchra, and the staghorn, the bottlebrush, whatever that axial tip is that is actually growing, when it's really flat, like you know you're giving that coral everything it needs. And I'm not saying that these new forms of amino acids are the only way to do it, but they are the direct cheat code to get to those perfectly flat growth tips of an Acropora.
I mean, you're probably right. The salifert aminos, like I said, back in the day when, you know, when my acroporas were littered with these parasitic little amphipod-looking things.
Fun fact, Mark and I were some of patient zeros for Tagastes acroporanus. I had gotten an amazing order of, I think they're Fiji corals, and I had you hold a couple of them because I didn't have a tank at the time, but I worked at the store. And then you got the red bugs and posted the infamous first red bugs thread on Reef Central, and we both thought they were kind of cool at first.
Yeah, posting pictures of them.
And then it was 6 months later, we're looking at your acros and just like, I don't know about this anymore. And then Dustin and ORA somehow concocted like this miracle cure. So I need to ask Dustin the origin story of that, but I want to save a little bit for next week. But in the meantime, at least just tell us what you have in mind for your next tank. What are you going to go with, and what are you going to try to achieve? I love that you already have this seemingly esoteric detail about your reef tank that you want 3 inches of lip above the water. Like that tells me that you've really given some good thought over this tank. But over a 20-year career, that's not too hard to do. So what are the goals for your next tank?
So I have some corals that have been with me for more than a decade. I have a Pavona coral that's 12 to 14 inches tall, and I want to get into a direction where maybe I start removing the number of distinct corals that I have and really showcasing the larger colonies and giving them even more room to grow.
This guy's going to go from like 18 corals to 9.
No, I counted. I have 30 distinct corals. So even if 2 are echinophilias, but they're different strains or colors, I count them separately. Right. I have 30 corals right now in my tank, and I'll probably...
Oh my God, I'm trying to think if any of my tanks has half of that, or twice that. I mean, yeah. I guess that tank probably has 30 corals, but that's one of the nanos.
That's the natural progression. I mean, if you allow your corals to grow, you have to either... I mean, unless you're going to bonsai the hell out of them, you're going to end up having either a bigger tank or less corals.
Absolutely. I think I'm a little bit more of an over-fragger because I'm always trying to like prune the colony shape. But right now I'm definitely at a point where I need to let a lot of the stuff just grow and then prune down the road. But I think it's so funny. You're going to have less than 30 corals in your 8-foot reef tank.
6 foot, yeah.
6 foot, yeah, 6 foot.
But the other part of it is I like open spaces. I want it to be very lagoonish. I don't know if I'll pull that off because I'm horrible at aquascaping. And I'm sort of like you where you were talking about the aquascaping of the rocks. Eventually the corals really become the aquascape. So, you can create really cool aquascapes but with rocks, but eventually it's all just overgrown with coral. So
right.
I don't know if I'll be able to pull it off because the downside of having a bunch of mature colonies is not like I can go buy a bunch of live rock and achieve my dream aquascape, right? Because otherwise I would have to frag all the corals and put them on the new rock. So I kind of have to work with the rocks, and I can't exactly stack rocks on top of each other.
Are you mostly planning to do a transplant from your old tank to the new one?
Yeah, and then just edit, say, hey, like really... what stays and what do I give away and get rid of. So, like a tridacnid clam on the sand bed, right? I've got 2 tridacnids. I got that squamosa that's blue, one of those blue ones. I've been wanting one of those for a long time. I want that thing to get massive, right? And I want to have space for it. I don't want it to be an afterthought addition. I want to be like, hey, this 2 by 2 foot section of this reef is your... grow, right?
Yeah, I'm in a similar place because I have a large blue squamosa in this tank and a large, just nice Durasa in that tank. And it's like, they've grown a lot. I think the blue squamosa warrants that space. That's a magnificent animal. Like truly one of the few things here in the studio that outshines practically every fish and every coral. But the Durasa less so. So it's a man, that's definitely some kind of sacrifice, but like, all right, I'm gonna keep a giant clam and it's gonna be a third of my reef tank.
Yeah, well, last time I had a squamosa, I had a bunch of rock back in the day, and I had to give it to the Georgia Aquarium. They put it in their mangrove lagoon because it just got too big for all the rock and corals that I had. So I thought, well, if I'm gonna get one of these again, I that needs to be part of my mindset, right? It's
make it count.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, with that, I think we still left a lot on the table to discuss. I have a lot more on my list. I really want to, on this show to discuss a little bit more of like the news of the week that has happened and that's going to be happening. I'm going to see if I can pull off a special permission for our next show to really like dive deep into like this brand new light that's coming out. But Mark, it's just been really exactly what I wanted out of this conversation, talking about Reef, staying on topic. At least have some tanks in the background that you can see, and I'm really excited that you're at a place where you're like, all right, it's time to transfer my Reef tank. Every time I've done a new Reef tank, it's always got a new theme. But anything else you want to leave the viewers with?
No, I mean, you know, I always say to each their own, you know, live and let live. These are just my opinions on how I do it, and you won't see me bash anybody for doing anything different. It's
I'm opinionated, but I really keep it all inside. But you know, he's got a bunch of rock and sand and no mechanical filtration. I've got no sand, very little rock, automatic filter roll. My lights are super blue for most of the photo period. Yours are, you know, purest white. That's what you should do.
We disagree on some things for sure, but I definitely think we both see each other's point of view of like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And
as long as it's evidence based and, you know, grounded in some of our collective education, I think that matters a lot. So thank you so much for joining me on this pilot episode of yet to be named Reef Builders Reef Chat program, and we'll catch you guys again very soon.
Thanks for having me.